Yeah.
Call screener for Ben when he did a radio show.
Yeah.
It
Oh.
was yours, yeah, way back.
Oh, that's a small world.
So you guys need a pep talk here, or you got it one? This guy doesn't need pep talk, I know. Good.
We're a team, aren't we?
Congregation Shalom. Many of us remember the moving and important stage reading at Congregation Shalom of the Soap Myth, featuring the late, great Ed Asner of blessed memory. And it's hard to believe that took place in April of 2019. And it feels like a world of time has passed since that date. Much has changed, and much has not changed. Just like then, there are still terrible crimes perpetrated by human beings against human beings. Whether it is war in Eastern Europe and the consistent rise of anti-Semitic and racist attitudes in our own country, dehumanization is still a pressing problem for which we as a community must continue to contend. The Holocaust is an event unique in history. Were it only that the sick ideologies and hatred that fueled the Shoah unique in our global experience. It is for this reason that the exploration of the stories of survivors and the stories of how we record history is so pertinent today and every day. And in the shadow of terrible events, the arts, journalism, media, historical narrative, and common morality are crucial aspects of our worlds that need reinforcing and strengthening by all people and peoples. Which brings me to our panel. We are fortunate to have such a spectacular group of scholars, artists, and journalists joining us today, and I have the honor of introducing them. First, I'd like to introduce Ruth Schwartzwager. She is Professor Emerita of German at UW-Milwaukee. Her publications include 4 books on German Jewish history and the Holocaust, including Women of Theresienstadt and a Nazi Camp near Danzig, recently released by Bloomsbury Press. Born and raised in Northern Ireland, she has also written Stories of Belfast and Beyond, published by the University of Wisconsin Press. I'd like to introduce Jeff Cohen, who is the playwright of the Soap Myth. Jeff is the recipient of a 2002 Drama Desk for the Tribeca Playhouse Stage Door Canteen, a free 10-week series to entertain the troops, the rescue and recovery workers at Ground Zero following the 9/11 attacks. Along with the Soap Myth, Mr. Cohen's acclaimed plays include Men of Clay, about his father and tennis, The Seagull, The Hamptons, starring Laura Linney in her New York stage debut, and D.B. Sweeney and the Man Who Ate Michael Rockefeller, and is the playwright, as I mentioned, of the Soap Myth, and a good friend of our congregation. It's good to have you here, Jeff. John Dietrich is an investigative reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. His work has uncovered dangers in industrial plants, hospital rooms, and the mixed martial arts ring, and revealed flaws in gun store regulations, witness intimidation protections, and federal undercover stings. John recently was part of a team exposing deadly risks from electrical fires, which hit Milwaukee's poor black renters the hardest. His work has been honored with numerous national awards, including a George Polk Award and Gerald Loeb Award. Before coming to the Journal-Sentinel in 2004, John covered the military and national security for the Gazette of Colorado Springs. And I believe, John, you're a native of Milwaukee too, right?
Right, yeah.
And then it is a joy to introduce Jeffrey Gingold. Jeffrey is an internationally acclaimed and award-winning author, a published freelance writer, and has authored and been interviewed for numerous articles in the United States and international publications, including the Times of Israel and The Forward. In 2014, his first book was translated into Polish, and in 2015, his second book was released in Dutch. Based upon recorded interviews with his grandmother and father, Jeffrey's newest book, Tunnel, Smuggle, Collect, A Holocaust Boy, shares his father's epic survival as a young boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. The gripping true story holds nothing back, receiving worldwide acclaim and the 2016 finalist Midwest Independent Publishing Book Award. Jeffrey also received an award from the Jewish war veterans for his dedication to telling the stories of history and personal acknowledgement from the United States Army for supporting learning from the Holocaust, legacy of perseverance education. It's a joy now also to introduce our moderator for today, our own Ben Marins. Ben is a 40-year veteran journalist who spent 21 of those years as a talk show host at Wisconsin Public Radio, also former congregational president here at Congregation Shalom. Got to add that to your bio too. Today he teaches storytelling, speaking, and listening skills. Ben and Dr. Shai Pilnick created the In Their Honor Holocaust Survivors Story Program for the Holocaust Education Resource Center. The interviews are available on the HERC website. During the pandemic, Ben has worked as a case manager with the Milwaukee Health Department, has run town hall meetings about COVID for the UW-Milwaukee Osher Lifelong Learning Institute to provide the latest updates on the virus. Ben penned his life lesson about listening in the book, People Are Dying to Be Heard. I'd also like to thank all those who endeavored to bring this event to its fruition. I'd like to thank Jeff Cohen, Carrie Altman, as always, for her tireless work at bringing such wonderful programs to our community, Linda Hollifield and the staff of Congregation Shalom, and in particular, Randy Levin for his enthusiasm and dedication to projects such as these, and Faye Levin as well. And we also think of Jordan of blessed memory, who was an integral part of bringing the reading of the soap myth to Congregation Shalom, and his memory still continues to be a source of motivation, goodness, and soulfulness in the life of his family and his community, which leads us to our sponsors. We are grateful for the gifts and generosity of Susie Levin, and I know that we are all thinking of Jordan today. It's good to have you here. And Randy and Faye Levin, and we also thank the Camille A. Lonstroff Trust for their participation and help in making this happen. Again, welcome to all of you, and we are overjoyed to share in this meaningful presentation. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi. And good afternoon. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out to the panel. Thank you for being here. I hate that. Benny, my grandmother scolded. We only hate Hitler, dear. Everything else and everyone else we can dislike, but we save our hate for Hitler. It defined my entire life. It defined the generation that I'm at the tail end of lives. We're here because we hate Hitler. But 100 or 200 or 300 years from now, that hatred will be something we may learn in history books. We won't feel. We won't have grandmothers scolding grandsons and explaining how we hate Hitler and we dislike everything else. Who has the right to write history? It's one of the questions we're going to talk about. The other question is, to me, that's really important, is the diminishment of the significance of the Holocaust, which begins probably in 1946. It certainly accelerates with the death of the last survivor whenever he or she passes. And a couple hundred years from now, I don't know anyone's going to want to have this panel. So I don't know it's what you write, but it's that you write what's significant, that people get some sense of what we're going to talk about here that no one can know if you weren't there. In the play, the discussion about history demanding certainty is spoken. And because the history we read and we've all experienced and will learn about in the future is like the blind man and the elephant from Kipling. It depends what they touch and how they describe it. And Jeff, I want to start with you because you've created a world, mimicking the world unfortunately we knew in your head. You have put it out here for us to learn and challenged yourself and us that history demands certainty. You wrote the words and yet there's no way we can have the certainty. So as we talk about who has the right to write history, and you're one of the writers of history, whether they read your play in 300 years or not, I don't know. But I'm wondering if you thought about the message that will be there when you're long gone based on the last version of the play.
Okay. Hi, everybody. First of all, Rabbi Noah, Carrie, all of my dear friends. We had such a wonderful, wonderful experience here back in 2019. I couldn't wait to get back here. And I'm thrilled to be back here, and I thank you all for hosting this. I'm avoiding answering your question. In case you didn't
I'll ask it
notice.
again.
So, this notion of history being sort of a finite, certain thing, I think is, I think one of the characters in the play says it, but I'm not sure that I buy it. Part of the thing about being a playwright, or especially in this play, is to provide different points of view and to allow the audience to make up their own minds. It's like people, you know, in the age of the pandemic saying that science is a certainty. So that if a doctor says that you must do X, Y, and Z on Tuesday, and then that means that's the end of the story. But we all know that's not true. You know, science learns and adapts. History, and the way we view history, adapts based upon, as the scholars say in the play, new evidence, based upon, you know, things that are happening today in our political world, where we see history being rewritten in real time as it happens. You know, the things that we watch on television, we're now being told we didn't see it. And sometimes evidence comes out 3 years later, 5 years later. There's an issue right now with the wife of a Supreme Court justice that we didn't really know about a couple of years ago. So history is adaptable and learns from itself. But there are certain truths, and then there are certain people who see their job as destroying those truths.
Jeff, as you see the growth of the media and the social media, what used to be history, because it was written about in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Milwaukee Journal, Sentinel, now there are 100-fold journalists, so to speak, people who broadcast and publish. Does that lessen the true history that we're seeing and that the people who research are trying to find?
You know, I think it's a question of context. And I hate to say it, that these things are complicated and complex, but they are. Even though we want them to be a bumper sticker, and we want that absolute, you can't just sort of slough it off and say, well, the opinion is the truth. There is some sort of collective acknowledgement. For example, you guys may not have heard a rumor that in the 1930s and the early 1940s, there was a movement to eradicate and exterminate all of the Jews of Europe. That's not an opinion. It's a fact. It's a truth. It's not fake news. And yet, when you listen to certain people today, people who wear t-shirts that say 6MWE. Have you heard of this? 6 million wasn't enough. then you have to use your brain and say, well, I'm not sure that that person's opinion is what we want to base historical accuracy and truth on. You asked me 300 years ago, what the impact of a play like The Soap Myth, whose purpose is to present truth. My answer is, hopefully, 300 years from now, the soap myth won't be necessary because it will be an established part of our collective history. And so much so that people coming after us will decide these things don't have to continue happening. Let's not do these anymore.
Jeff,
a lot of people, just one more thing about that, which is that, thank goodness there are those who survived the Holocaust. Thank goodness Nazi Germany didn't win the war. Thank goodness there are people who are alive to tell the story. Because the world would look like a very, very different place if that weren't the case.
Jeff, I'm going to stop you, but I thank you.
Yeah.
I know you could do this all on your own, but we want to blend.
Sure, absolutely.
And based on what you just said, it's a nice little segue and blend into Jeffrey to talk about your legacy, your obligation, and the obligation of your grandchildren, great-grandchildren to tell the story that I don't have to tell in the same way you do. How do you view that, and how do you bear it?
I believe that memory doesn't endure by itself, and it needs vehicles, people, to move it forward. And if I don't, if our children don't, it'll vanish. Whatever happened to my family, whatever happened in the Holocaust, it'll just be a rumor. We need personal experience, and we need to be able to explain that and share it with other people.
Now, you do it from a very personal standpoint, and will. John, you take on the mantle as journalists, we're daily historians. We're not sure we're writing history, we're writing what happened today, but years from now, the historians will look at, among other things, the work that we do when we write and publish on a daily or regular basis. So when we talk about who has the right to write history, you're doing that in a way now. Do you think of it that way?
It is when you put it that way, when you get into this business, you don't sort of think of it that way. And at some point, I don't know, some years into it, I started to become aware of other people who had covered the beats that I was covering then, and then thinking about, we have a thing which is going away at newspapers, it's called a morgue, where the old clippings from the old newspapers would all be categorized. And I would go into those sometimes, and you'd be reading what colleagues had written decades or generations before. And the magnitude of that really settles. I think the weight of it has occurred to me more as career has gone on, and feel like it's not only of the moment, but it's important for historical purposes to get it right. And as you alluded to, we live in a period of time right now that is, we've had a proliferation of media that's it's remarkable. I think I've heard it compared that this period of time is comparable to the invention of the printing press 500 years ago. It's been so dramatic, the change. And the sort of means to publish, that used to be a big deal. The joke would be, well, you can't argue with the newspaper because they buy ink by the barrel. Well, that's all kind of out the window now. And there are individuals through social media who have arguably as much or more impact than main long-standing media organizations. And it's just a different world to be aware of, and the historical implications to your original question are just very real, and I do think about that now.
And Jeff makes the point, 300 years from now, we'll just be sort of given an understanding. We won't have to have this discussion. But every day between now and till 300 years, there's more news, there's more tragedy. We're at the point now where shootings in our local high schools are no longer lead stories because we're numb to it. What's going on in Ukraine may be as big as the Holocaust someday. We don't really know. But because you're talking about the Ukraine, we're not going to talk about the Holocaust. So it seems like as time goes on, I don't know if the question also should be, will history write about the Holocaust anymore? So Ruth, you read and teach literature,
Yes,
and from the
teach
European
literature.
era,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering what you would say to that.
Well, what I think contemporary readers and future readers, I don't know about 300 years, but I know that future readers will read Jeff Cohen's play, The Soap Myth. And my sense is that they will see in this work his insistence on specificity. The Holocaust happened. And I think it was very audacious of him to take the soap myth, in other words, an ordinary item, and project on that all the histories that have been written around that were actually perversely used to show that the Holocaust didn't happen. I see in his work layers of significance and meaning for the future that will give the likes of me, and I have to add that I was educated on the mean streets of Belfast. So I think I have an eye for what's going to last. I think he has asked a very significant question, and he has navigated on so many layers. And at the end of the day, we still hear the voice of an old man. Presumably you've all seen this and read it. And it's his anguish that breaks our hearts. If we don't listen to survivors, I don't know how on earth that Jeffrey will be able to write, or that I'll be able to write about it. That's my job.
Thank you, Ruth. So talking about writing, if those of you who have questions want to write them down and hand them up to Linda or Randy as they walk around in a little bit, I'm glad to get your questions. So if you have stuff that comes up, please let us know. So we have the play, and you've, as a playwright, changed it several times. I would assume that if history can always be changing about what we just still don't know about what happened 50, 80, 100 years ago, what led up to and what caused the Holocaust, we're still learning that. So I'm wondering if that, again, blurs the history that people will learn in the future, or somehow makes it easier to understand and to grasp. When you said it happened, it's a fact. There are generations of people coming that a lot of us are worried won't treat it that way.
It's up to us. It's not a passive experience. It's not an experience where, where you say, oh, well, she'll do it. She'll get some kids in her classroom and she'll teach them. We don't have to do that. Very good friend of mine made an interesting point about the play and about memory and about and defined it in terms of the Jewish people. We are the Jewish people because of a collective memory, because of stories that have been handed down for thousands of years and were written down and are repeated on high holy days and repeated on Shabbat and repeated, and become a part of a culture that has a collective memory. When I was driving in, there was a sign on the road for an African American Holocaust museum, which I find to be extraordinary because it's so apt. The Holocaust is not something that we as Jewish people own or that is only significant to us. You know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Africans bought and sold in their native country and then brought in chains and then stripped and destroyed and dehumanized, which is what the Nazis were to do to the Jewish people. We are putting them in the camps and dehumanizing them. So I think that the only way to stop it is to learn about it and to be active about it. One of the lines that I changed in the play from what you saw in the recording is at the very end of the play when Annie, the young journalist, when she says, and I added this because it's important, who will be alive to tell the story? Well, that's something that I feel I must do. And hopefully a play like The Soap Myth or anything related to this horrible chapter in human history is something which we will continue to tell. And tell it to whoever wants to listen or for those who don't want to listen. Because it's happened one way or another to everyone and every people. And that's really the only way society moves forward, is if we insist upon being active and passionate about these stories.
And in the play, there's a challenge is the making of soap out of the fat from Jewish prisoners a myth or not? And Sam, isn't eyewitness accountability proof enough? And the play talks about that. And one of our members in the audience today wants each of you, and Jeffrey, we'll start with you as you talk about it from the family perspective. What defines evidence to prove a fact?
I think having a witness or a corroborated witness, to me it's sort of like hearsay testimony. One person saying it happened in court is not enough without some substantiation. I think multiple witnesses testifying, I think that's a lot. I had a chance Thursday, I talked with Michael Berenbaum, and we talked about why the word myth, why, and perhaps he can answer that better than I can, but we talked about it. And I asked him, I said, if the word myth did not exist, because in the play he's quoted as saying, it's a soap myth. I said, okay, this word doesn't exist, what would you say instead of myth? It wouldn't sound very lyrical for a play, but he said it's unsubstantiated evidence. And that's what he meant by a myth. And everybody can interpret it for themselves. And I asked him, I said, well, would more people testifying it? And he said, that's useful, but records, documents, things like that are easier to show other people because they stand on their own as opposed to what someone's thought happened. The memory, we talked about how memory alters facts. If it's substantiated with documents, it's on its face clear. I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it challenges the conundrum that's discussed in the play, so it's actually really well said. Ruth, as you read the way literature presents history, and obviously some of it's historical fiction, so it's blending the two. So as someone who studies this and teaches, how do you explain what defines as evidence to prove a fact versus we don't know, but it sounds good?
Well, Günter Grass, the Nobel Prize winner, German Nobel Prize winner. He, in fact, alluded to the soap myth being made in Stutthof. Soap, in fact, was made in the Anatomical Institute in Danzig, 22 miles away from Stutthof, the camp. And some of the evidence was used at the Nuremberg trials by the Soviets. Then in 1947, that evidence was questioned, and the British investigated Dr. Rudolf Spanner, who was in charge of this anatomical institute in Danzig. And the findings were not very clear, and in fact, they more or less exonerated him. The question is, where did he get the corpses from? And he said that he had used corpses from some of the sub-camps. In one in particular, which would have been like I would say at least 200 miles away from Danzig. So that was questioned, and probably rightly so. But the fact remains that soap was made. He claimed that he was making it kind of in what he called in machinations, and he was going to be applying it to limbs, the limbs of corpses, of course. It was a very, very strange investigation that the British made, and this is 1947, and it was dismissed as rather unpleasant and not verifiable. But I think we need to be quite clear that soap was made. And one of the people involved in this was, who worked for Spanner, was a Polish guy called Mazur, and he also went up to Nuremberg to the trials. And again, his testimony was very garbled, and he wasn't quite sure, etc. But soap was made in the Danzig Institute, and one witness said it was used for cleaning purposes. But what it does is it's confusing, but I think the fact that we have clear evidence of soap having been made does, frankly, cause us to ask a lot of questions. I would just briefly say, if I might, Ben, that this guy Spanner was never in the SS, and that's very important about this era. He was in what the Germans called the Ärztebund, which is the Association of Medical Doctors. And there were a lot of medical doctors in the SS, loads of them, and loved being in there. But this fella didn't make it. And frankly, reading through his records, I concluded that it was not evidence that I certainly did not use bring into my book. I have it, I think, as a footnote. But they did remove the soap bar, a bar of soap, from the Stutthof Museum exhibit in 2002. And they had done a lot of work.
John is somebody who has to decide what's fact or not, because once you put it in play, people are going to be able to read it and know, versus those of us who speak who aren't recorded, they may forget us. But you're putting it down, so do you have a heavier burden of proof than what you're hearing everyone else talk about here? Or is it just different because you're a journalist versus a professor of history?
Well, I think the question that when we consider eyewitness accounts, and we do regularly, when we're doing investigative work, it's one of the components that we look at when we interview people to say, you know, there is an allegation that's being made. What is the truth of that? What is the supporting evidence of that? One thing that gives pause, on the one hand, is that, and I've covered a number of court trials over the years, is that, you know, if you have a bank robbery, it's notorious the different accounts that individuals will give of what the robbers look like and details that happened in the robbery. The FBI talks about this, that eyewitness accounts can be wrong. Yet in my experience, what when I've interviewed people, over time it's become, I think, a technique not to fill in gaps and not to share information that might be individually known. But I think where in the play, what is powerfully stated is the presence of other information that's supporting. And it's not as if this allegation exists in it doesn't exist on its own, and it also actually follows a very clear pattern of the other acts that are detailed are supportive of this. That's a starting point, and then it goes further to detail some of the support that Ruth shared. What we do in our work is not to shy away from that as much as to provide the context, and to what Jeff talked about at the beginning, to respect the reader's, or in this case, the viewer's intellect, and to present what we can, not to withdraw or actually label it as such, but say, here's the evidence toward this. Having just seen the play the other night here, it is so compelling, and for anybody who hasn't seen it, it is so compelling because it raises, you think you know the answer, and then literally you go back and forth throughout it. That is a compelling piece of work, and to me, that's what we miss a lot now. Social media is here's what you should think, and doesn't respect the reader or the viewer's intellect to tell them what we know and then draw them deeper and have them come to their own conclusions. Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff, I want you to answer that question and then segue into the other question that a couple of people have asked, so I guess they want to know the answer to, and I want all of you to address this. How does one deal or respond to someone who believes the big lie, who is a denier, who says, of course it didn't happen, I have proof? So both, how do you prove the fact? What does that mean for evidence in your thinking? And then how do you deal with the deniers when you have the chance to talk to them face to face?
Michael Berenbaum is one of my favorite human beings in the world. And here's an interesting story about how do we write history. When I first presented the play to a friend of mine named Arnold Middleman to produce it, he said, well, Michael Berenbaum is on my board, and let him read it. He said, I have really bad news for you. I said, what? He said, I can't produce your play. I said, why not? Michael said they didn't make soap, and he can't get behind it. And I can't, Arnold's company is called the National Jewish Theater Foundation. So he said, if Michael doesn't get on board with it, I can't do it, I'm sorry. I engaged Michael in an email conversation about Danzig, about Nuremberg, about those things. A few months later, Arnold called me up and said, Michael was giving a talk. There was, someone asked a question at the end, said, can you tell us about soap? And Michael said, well, I will admit that it's possible that they had successful experiments, but they did not mass manufacture it. I immediately called him up, and I said, can I quote you? And God love him, he said, I said it, I stand by it, yes. Since that time, he has become the greatest champion of the play. And the reason is because from his perspective, which is very important, it exposes a conflict that we often don't think about between the survivor, the eyewitness, and the historian. And there is this conflict, which Michael knows very well because he's had Milton Saltzman come and attack him about his historical criteria. And you think that we're all on the same side. But it's an interesting kind of a rupture. He likes to quote Elie Wiesel, and this, I'm going to butcher this, so I apologize. Only those who were there can know. and those who weren't can't know. And that's a really interesting standard. So that's one way in which history becomes malleable. Nobody had ever thought to bring up this notion of the soap myth before this play. Trust me, I know.
If we ultimately believe what Wiesel is saying, though, we wouldn't be here because we don't agree with that. We can't know it the way he knew it, but we think it's critical. Not only do we know it, but future generations.
Right, but there is that sense of the experience. And then look, it's what Annie says late in the play. Milton Saltzman, that survivor, that man, is the history. Now, whether or not somebody told him that he was bathing with human soap, whether we then extrapolate that he was bathing with human soap, it's almost an irrelevant question. The fact that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries throughout Eastern Europe, where they buried soap. That's a collective sense of truth. It doesn't necessarily mean that in every one of those caskets that soap is human soap. You have to make that decision. But certainly it was told to them. Certainly the Germans had this great sense of gallows humor by saying, aha, you are bathing with the corpse of your mother and your father. Why deny that horrific experience? Second part.
How do you talk to the deniers?
About those who would desecrate history, which Putin is doing as we speak, calling Zelensky a Nazi, right? And people believe him. People in this country believe him, and certainly people in his country who do not have access to other avenues of reporting believe him. What can you do? My answer is to write a play and to make sure that after every performance of the play, this happens. This conversation happens. So that we can air it out. You know, Annie has a speech in the play where she says, you know, sometimes I feel like Milton Saltzman, and I want to say, you know, to the deniers, it's not up to us to prove that it happened. It's up to you to prove that it didn't. And if you can't, then we won't give you a platform to spew your poison. That's not a terrible way to approach this. You know, rather than hiding or giving ground, because that's what I think happened with soap. Mm-hmm. I believe, and you won't get any of the historians that will admit to it, but I believe that when the deniers went after soap as that thing, you see, if they will lie about something like soap, what else will they lie about? That the historians said, you know what, it's better to take soap off the table. It doesn't diminish what they did, but it certainly doesn't give them the fuel that they're looking for. Is that the right decision? I don't know.
I want to move on to others, but I got to come back and ask you one quick question, though.
Sorry?
You're asking people to prove a negative, which we ought to talk is sort of farcical in a court of law, right? So how would we expect deniers to prove the negative, especially if we believe it can't be proved, as opposed to say, I can show you it happened? Isn't that a more powerful way to go?
It's just my, you know, it's you know, if somebody accuses me of being a pedophile and just starts spewing that all over their keyboard, how do you respond to that? By the way, I'm not. But how do you respond to that? when you say I'm not, it only makes you think, well, maybe he is. Right? I mean, these are well-worn tactics that have been successful through the ages. And really, I would, for myself, and I'm a little bit of a firebrand, but for myself, what I would say is the only way to combat it is to do battle with it. And I just want to add one thing, and that's why the soap myth as a play has become, you know, I've written other plays. I have a life. But the soap myth doesn't let me rest, because I want to see the soap myth on a platform with a megaphone that does battle with those who would deny and those who would desecrate, and becomes part of the conversation so that we don't cede the spotlight to those who wear t-shirts that say 6MWE. And that's why, you know, part of the journey of this play is to put it on Broadway with a major star or what have you, so that the world will take notice. Because, you know, the world would love to forget. There is anti-Semitism in the world. And the anti-Semites do have an agenda. And part of that is to disparage what we as a people have gone through.
So from Jeff to Jeffrey, you lived it, you've experienced it with family, and someone looks you in the eye and says, it never happened.
Through 50 or 60 book signings and presentations I've done, I've been asked directly, and that's always a question when a hand goes up, everyone will look to this person who asks, what do you say to the deniers? What do you say about that? And my answer is simple. Deniers don't have evidence. They have doubt, which means they have to doubt all the testimony of the survivors. They have to doubt all the evidence, all the thousands of pages of documentation. They have to doubt the perpetrators. They have to doubt the accountant of Auschwitz who recorded what happened. And their doubt is not to be relied on. The perpetrators, I understand, I tell people, never denied that it happened. The perpetrators said they were following orders. It's not their responsibility, not their fault, but they never said it never happened. And the other thing I always thought of, but I've never said it, because I don't know the reaction I'll get, is that think of everything that a denier says. There isn't a museum for deniers. Deniers don't have a museum. There is no evidence. It's just doubt. That's what I tell people.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jeffrey. And John?
The notion of trying to discount or shape an agenda, certainly that was going on with the Nazis, and I think we see that today. I guess the approach that I have sort of taken on I start from a position that there is evil in the world, and that continues today, and this was certainly true at the time of the Nazis, and that shining a light into those dark places is important. And I think ultimately to try to contain or control the dark places is impossible to some degree. So I guess my feeling over time has been to continue to bring light into those dark places and bear witness when we see trauma and evil and injustice of all sorts, and present that again to readers and viewers to decide for themselves, and that I'm convinced eventually that the light overcomes the darkness.
Ruth?
I was brought up in Northern Ireland in a home that was very pious and belonged denominationally to the same group who saved several thousand Jews in Le Chambon in France. They hid them on their farms from the French Gestapo, and so this has clearly influenced and shaped my own sensibilities. In a sense, I don't belong here, and I feel humbled to be between these two dear men. And please know I say that from the depths of my heart. I was giving a paper in France, in Paris, at a colloquium, and had the nerve to do it in French. Did my very best. I'm sure it was a sketch. But I finished my paper, and I was speaking on the rescue of German Jews in Le Chambon. And a French reporter interviewed me afterwards. And she looked at me and she told me I was a liar. Vous n'êtes pas protestant, she said. Vous êtes juif. And in the interest of honesty, I said, actually, you know, I would be very proud to be called a Jew, but I'm not. And this woman, with such contempt, she could have been part of Jeff's play. She looked at me and she said, Madame, vous êtes juif. And it was just, for me, just a little whiff of an anti-Semitism in a very cultured setting that was absolutely chilling. And I walked away and I said, oui, madame. I've hated it when I'm teaching to have to deal with this, and I think I've dealt with it. I don't know if any of my former students are in the audience, but I think I've always dealt with it very firmly. If I get even a whiff, a soupçon, as the French would say, so snobbily, of any anti-Semitism, I'm right on it. How dare you?
Another question has to do with the role of the arts. So, Jeff, I'll start with you. Wants the role of the arts to be true to the truth, free from embellishments, to create the final piece. Is there a role to that, or should it always be open, whether you rewrite your play or your novel, always be open to being altered?
Say that again, sorry?
We want to know what the responsibility of the arts.
Of the artist.
Of the arts, so yes, anybody involved in it, so in this case you as a playwright, to be true to the truth and free from embellishments that would create, so they can create what would be considered a final piece.
I mean, so, you know, as someone who pretends to be an artist, I would say that anytime you try to put an artist in a box, you're doing a disservice to the arts. Every artist approaches every topic differently. Every artist, you know, has to be true to their own sense of you know, of creativity and conscience. As far as that relates to the play, the one thing that I realized early on, which really prompted a complete and total rewrite of the play very early on, just so you know, I'm very fortunate in that all of my family, both sides, came from the Ukraine, came from Russia in the early 20th century. So I don't have any relatives that were affected. I'm not a 2G. I'm not, you know, by the Holocaust. So when I was first apprised of this topic of soap, you know, I was kind of like Annie Blumberg in the play. I'm like, what is this? I've never heard of this. I mean, I've heard of soap, but I didn't know there was a controversy. And it allowed me to go deeply into a history that I really didn't know much about beforehand. And so one of the things that I learned very early on is when you write a play about history, and especially about the history of the Holocaust, it's a requirement that you get everything right, that you are 100% accurate. You cannot subject your play to the denier who would say, oh, see, you got that wrong, and that means all the other things are wrong as well.
So even an artist, you're concerned about that?
It depends upon the topic. Not to digress, but I wrote another play called The Righteous about a German industrialist who warned the world of the final solution in July of 1942. And his, this volatile evidence that he had was in a document called the Regner Telegram, which eventually went to FDR, who met with Rabbi Stephen Wise in December of 1942. And the State Department had said that what's in this document is real. And Roosevelt said, it's terrible, but we're going to win the war, so it doesn't matter. A lot of people don't know about that. A historian who wrote the book about this industrialist, this German named Edward Schulte, whose identity was a closely guarded secret until 1983, called me up and said, you got facts wrong in your play. I said, okay. He said, Schulte never met with Himmler, and he didn't find out directly from Himmler about the final solution. And I said, oh, okay, how do you know? Well, he just didn't. And that's a factual dispute. That's something where I go, well, it's kind of poetic license. It was really dramatic, in my opinion, to write a scene with Himmler and this guy, Edward Schulte, who despised the Nazis, and to have this sort of tension in this scene. And the historian said, but you got it wrong. So, what can you do as an artist? I don't think that I got anything substantively wrong. And you're gonna have to make it dramatic where people aren't gonna care. That's the beauty of art.
I was going to say, as an artist, is your goal historical accuracy, though?
Sorry?
Is your goal historical accuracy?
Not necessarily, no. My goal is to provoke and entertain, which I hope the Soap Myth did for all of you, which is why you're here. That's my goal as an artist, so that it lives beyond the walls and the literal experience of absolute, just the facts.
We'll start on this end this time. So, John, what about your thoughts as a journalist when you look at the role of the arts and whether or not truth is the goal, or entertainment and education and engagement?
Well, it's interesting. I've actually had an experience with an investigation that my reporting partner and wife Raquel and I worked on. She's here today, involving the ATF and a storefront operation that they ran in Milwaukee. And one of the aspects of that operation was an individual who had a low IQ of Chauncey Wright. His name is Chauncey Wright. Was targeted by the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and utilized in the sting operation, and then charged at the end. And this is one of many findings within this. And there was somebody from Chicago, a playwright, who approached us about doing a story, and it was in the public domain, so it could be written. And that's what Timeline Theater does in Chicago. And it's really interesting what they did with it, because it became this just really deep study on Chauncey's life and what was going on. He met with Chauncey and his family and so forth. And yeah, there were aspects of the details that were, they were dramatized. There were things that were skipped over. There was aspects of it that were imagined conversations that we could not include in our story because of the level of sort of scrutiny for facts. And the power that came from that play, while we were, blessed to go down there and see it and do a talk back afterward. And again, that was a really key part of it because I think we were able to engage with the audience. So they could access this information that was substantially correct in a different way. And I just was really honored and just humbled by the fact that there was another place that this could come, another venue where people might not have read it or known that story in a different way. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think there is, a place for that. And I think the questions of like when you come in, and whether you're getting history from it, because I think sometimes people have come back to say, well, I saw that in a movie and that was totally imagined. It didn't happen. And that can be okay. And then there's some things that are like just false and wrong. So I think it's a case-by-case basis. In my experience, it was really powerfully done, and I think it really shared with a different audience that wouldn't have been able to engage this information.
I mean, just to add, Shakespeare was notorious for, creating his own facts and his own history. The Henry plays, the history plays. Richard III, with the hump and the limp, and apparently never had that. But it certainly made for a great character. Now is the winter of our discontent, right? So, you have to, we'd be much poorer, if those plays didn't exist and if they didn't move us every time we see them.
Jeffrey, the idea of the arts and truth.
Your use of the word precise. I think that when we're talking about the Holocaust, we have to be precise because, back to the deniers, there are people out there who want to pounce on any flaw, any misstep we have. And going back to the recent conversation I had with Michael Bierenbaum, I said, okay, so I understand from the soap myth why there was a need. The people involved didn't want to do a separate exhibit. And that, I said, can you give me a different example from the Holocaust? Totally different that I can understand. And he said, well, how memory isn't always evidence. And he said, yes. And he named one woman that he talked to who had been in Buchenwald, I believe. And she discussed how on her entrance to the concentration camp, there was the Arbeit macht frei, and etc. And he didn't correct her, but the truth was there was no sign like that at Buchenwald. That was her memory, which was changed a bit by possibly other people. Her understanding of history, somehow it morphed, and that was her reality. And he said, we can't go with that. We can talk about the rest of her experience in the Holocaust, but not everything can be just taken without independent verification. And I think that's very important, and you accomplished that showing the balance. What a balance. I picture this tightrope walker with the long stick with two weights on both sides, and that's how I felt. Well done.
So the last question I want to pose, we'll start with you, Ruth, and you can wrap up final comments with this too, I guess. John, you were talking about what constitutes sort of telling the complete story, and the goal is to get the facts and put it out there, yet you have column inches, so you don't get room for the complete story most of the time. And so in that regard, it's a space issue. Sometimes it's a time and attention issue. Some of it be historical. So the last question I want you guys to address for us is, what constitutes telling the complete story of the Holocaust today and in the future? Ruth, I'll start with you.
That's a very...
I hand that to you.
Yes.
Good luck.
I was going to give it right back to you.
No, you can't. But I guess what I'm wondering is complete in that do you have to have all the facts and the details? And if you don't, is it okay so you don't have everything included? The question and debate about soap and soap myth. But what will make it complete so we won't say the world lost the message that we learned?
That is an impossible question in many ways. I think I go back to the insistence on specificity that I believe is really embedded in your drama, Jeff. And I also think of the success of Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. I mean, that depended on specificity. Nobody had any doubt. Well, how many yards was it? And what exactly did you see on the... I mean, it was extraordinary. And I cannot think of any other work of the Holocaust that has affected and shaped my own work more than that. That's always your goal, to give as much as you can.
Okay.
I mean, I took, I would say, 6 or 7 years writing this book on Stutthof. And clearly I work rather slowly. But I was always attempting, at least, in every aspect that I was looking at, which went from clearly victims were up front and central, but then the perpetrators. Who in the world were these people? What shaped them? And I was in the reviews I got initially, I got things like, well, you're asking religious questions here that maybe don't belong. I certainly was, and I kept on asking them. And I think that has been a great help for me in making sure that I can get as much as the knowledge that I have myself, doing the homework, to get as complete and full a story as I can.
John, as you write about events that happened in the past, you obviously summarize history. How do you see that going on in the future when it comes to the Holocaust and not having necessarily shelves and shelves for books or newspaper archives?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's, I think it's one that it is surprising when you talk with audiences, the lack of knowledge, depending on generations, as it passes, that this happened. It seems, I was talking to my son about it, and it seems so, he's 18, and it seems so unbelievable. And so I think he's also one who relishes documentaries. So he's seen this, and he's of that mindset. I guess my sense in this is not to tell the entire story, but to tell part of it well and continue that. I think the breadth of it is overwhelming sometimes. It's the same thing, and Jeff, you were mentioning the African-American experience. It's overwhelming, the heartache, the trauma, and just the facts and the details. And so I think if we can tell one part of it well and continue to tell it, and even if it's not a new part, but maybe it's new to an audience, that we continue to bring that out, because just like the playwright in our case, in that story, he took one part of a pretty big investigation and brought it forth and told it through human eyes. And that, to me, is always the key, and that's the genius of this play, is the human beings tell the history. And that's what we're we're history tellers, storytellers for our entire human history. That's how we communicate. And I think so. I think it's through the smaller story shared through human beings is the way.
Jeffrey?
I think it's important through the school groups that I've talked to, and I've spoken to a lot of children. I tell them, don't worry about understanding everything at this point. Just record the information, talk to your relatives. You'll understand it, hopefully, later. But before it vanishes, before people pass away, get the information firsthand, listen to their stories, document it, record it. You'll know what to do with it later. And I think that's important for everyone to do with their families and friends. Because how many times you look back and say, you know, I should have asked.
Jeff, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, the only thing that I would, to leave with is however many were slaughtered and murdered, whatever the accurate number is, and I don't think obviously we'll ever have an accurate number. Those are stories that we can't tell. Those are stories that we'll never tell unless they were told by the relatives who survived it. We do have survivors, and we have children of survivors. And we can, each story is individual. There's a theme in the play: how does a survivor survive surviving? Anyone who knows a survivor knows that they handle what happened to them individually. Some of them speak about it often and speak to groups and speak, and that becomes their. Some of them never, ever, ever, ever speak about it. Like Milton. And when offered an opportunity to speak, decline. Why? I'm sure there's lots of reasons. As far as the sort of this general sense of, how do we tell history? That's the definition of culture. The only way that our culture can move forward, the only way that we can move forward with not treating human beings as slaves, or women as property, or or 1,000 other things, is to continue to move forward and hope that our better angels will always vanquish the evil ones. And I think that the arc of history is in that direction. I tend to be like you. I tend to be optimistic about, if my play reaches 3 people and changes the way they view history, that's a win. That's fantastic. And that's, I think, I would say with all of us, that's the thing that motivates us. And we give it as a gift to you and hope that you will continue and it will motivate you as well. And that's how the culture continues forward.
Well, hopefully we've learned and will somehow be changed by being here, and hope change others by just sharing the information while we are still able to do it. Jeffrey and Ruth and Jeff and John, thank you so much.
And thank you. A wonderful job. And thank you guys for coming out during the pandemic.
Also, by the way, thank you to the congregation for bringing it here. Carrie, as always, putting together another wonderful event, which we greatly appreciate. And Randy, where's Randy floating around here somewhere? Oh, he's right there. Yeah. Thank you, Randy.
By the way, none of this would ever have happened were it not for Randy Levin. Ed Asner would never have been here. Well, actually, I should say our mutual friend, Marty Rudoy. Yes. Yeah, I'm so indebted to you and your friendship. Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Funny. Isn't everybody in Milwaukee
I can't hear
a
you.
neighbor?
Oh, I did. You didn't even notice. Yeah, we got the audience questions in. Yeah.
I don't leave until tomorrow afternoon, so if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. You too.
You guys played nice.